What is up, guys? TopTierYugioh here, and today I just want to have a brief metagame discussion with you guys where we cover the current state of the game, some trends, and then what the top 5 decks of the format are. And again, this is a discussion, so please let me know what you guys think about the current metagame in the comment section because I'd love to hear what you guys have to say too. So let's go ahead and get started. And now first, I think when most people think about a format, they usually only think about what decks are on top and then what they think about them individually and where they rank. And trust me, we're going to get to that. We're going to be ranking the decks, but more than anything, and first things first, I think you really need to take a top-down approach to it. You need to look at not only what decks are doing well, but the types of decks that are doing well and how they interact with each other, because I think that more than anything, that can change how we approach the current format. And so when I do this, when I look at the format right now, I'm really only seeing 3 types of decks having success. Those 3 types of decks being the interactive combo decks, the floodgate combo decks, and then the hand trap decks. And now I know it's easy to look at the first 2, or at least hear about the first 2 and think that these are the same thing and that they're similar because they're both combo decks, but they're different types of combo decks that function very differently in that the interactive combo decks will often end on boards with multiple disruptions and interactions, typically in different zones of the game, those zones being in the hand, the field, the graveyard, and the spell and trap card zone. And I would define an interactive combo deck as one that, like, the main combo is ending on at least 3 interruptions in at least 2 different zones. And they can also end on different and dynamic boards depending on the situation, and it's their flexibility that can be key to their success. I think an example of this would be like Virtual World, Adventure Tenyi, Sword Soul, and then the Based deck to an extent. Based is, we'll talk about Based. But after that, you've got the floodgate combo decks that typically end on some sort of floodgate, whether it be a Scythe, a Lancia, or any other floodgate that allows them to stop the opponent from playing it. So it's a combo deck, but it is not interactive. You cannot interact with it. If you're locked out of your extra deck, there's nothing you can do. And right now, the biggest culprits of this are the Phantom Knight decks and the Drytron decks. Their combos are much more streamlined, and if they resolve fully, they're typically an FTK. They lock you out of the extra deck and they kill you next turn. But that is why the hand trap decks are so important right now. It's almost necessitated it because if you're not stopping these decks before they set up, you're just losing. And so that's why now you're seeing decks that are playing 10, 12, and sometimes close to 20 hand traps in 60 card decks. It's these higher hand trap counts that allows them to be strong going first or second, and it allows them to completely stop the less flexible combo decks, the floodgate ones. And so I define any hand trap deck as one with a probability of opening more than one hand trap greater than 50%. And I've worked out the math, and it's any deck that plays 13 hand traps in a 40 or 41 card deck, 14 hand traps in a 42 to 45 card deck, scaling up to 19 hand traps in a 60 card deck. And so you have the interactive combo decks, the floodgate combo decks, and then the hand trap decks. And between these 3, it's beginning to look like a triangle format, to where the floodgate decks are beating the interactive decks because if their engines go head to head, floodgate deck is going to win because the interactive combo deck cannot play. However, the floodgate decks are losing to the hand trap decks due to their own linearity and fragility to hand traps, as well as the hand trap deck's ability to have interruption through the floodgate. And so even if they get Scythe locked on turn 1, they can stop the follow-up. Then, you know, the Phantom Knight deck, for example, isn't going to have a second Scythe on next turn. And so then on that turn afterwards, the hand trap deck can truly start playing, and they can be more efficient than the floodgate deck. However, the hand trap decks lose to the interactive combo decks because the interactive combo decks are dynamic. They're able to play through hand traps. And so you've got sort of a triangle going on. But more than anything, it comes down to how well these decks play in simple versus complex game states. Floodgates inherently simplify the game state massively, but interactive decks thrive in complex game states. Hand trap decks do simplify the game state, but they don't do it enough. And so even if they have 2 hand traps and they're left with 3 cards in hand, 3 Virtual World cards is a lot better than 3 Prank cards are. And so once again, we've got a situation where the interactive decks beat the hand trap decks, which beat the floodgate decks, which beat the interactive decks. If we look at YCS Vegas from a couple of weeks ago, I believe Based won due to this dynamic. Going into the event, we were all fearing Scythe and Phantom Knight decks the most, and to combat this, the result was 10 hand trap decks in the top 32, more than any form of combo deck. And the most popular archetype of the top cut, which were Prank Kids, were primarily used as a hand trap deck. And now because the most common deck in Top Cut was a hand trap deck, it was almost inevitable that an interactive combo deck was going to win. And while base can primarily function as a floodgate deck, it's versatile enough to be able to also function as an interactive deck because it does have access to multiple forms of disruption and defense in different zones of the game. They can end with, of course, their main monster zone negations, but also they have access to Snow via Riser Dragon. And as we all know, Snow is very good against prank kids. You flip their prank kid face down, they can't link with it. And so this dynamic between types of decks was very important going into this event, and I think it's going to be important moving forward as well. But before talking about the future, let's also continue looking back at YCS Vegas. And so again, this dynamic between the different types of decks was very important going into YCS Vegas, and you can see how it affected the results. And if we take a deeper look at the YCS Vegas Top Cut, I've got 30 of the 32 list here in Excel. I really want to break it down for you guys. And so first I want to look at the hand trap counts. And you might be wondering why, and the reason is that 19 out of 32 decks played an Adventure Engine, and I'm actually missing 2, and so it could have been a maximum of 21 out of 32 decks playing the Adventure Engine, and most of them played 3 copies of Rite of Adamysir and then 3 copies of Enchantress. The average deck size of top 32 was 44 cards, and that gives them a 53.8% chance of drawing one of their ways to get to eventually a Griffin Rider. And so if you're going second and your opponent has Griffin Rider, they're going to have some type of early negation, and that also does not include the decks that might be summoning a Baron, a Crystal Wing, a Herald, or something else early on in those cases. And in those cases, you are going to need more than one hand trap to truly stop their plays. And again, this is what led to the rise of the hand trap deck, while we're also seeing greater deck size so that you have space for more hand traps. So it is very important that your deck is able to see its hand traps right now. And so once again, of the top 32, there's an average of 44 cards in the deck with about an average of 11 hand traps in them. This gives them a 78% chance of seeing 1 and then a 37% chance of seeing 2. And so you can expect to be double hand trapped at least once a match or so. And even though there are a lot of hand traps in the format, I still would only define 7 of these decks as hand trap decks. And again, I would consider that being any deck with a probability of opening more than one hand trap greater than 50%. And only 7 of these decks meet that criteria. However, there are 4 more decks that were literally 1 card off from hitting that 50% threshold. And if we include them, that's 11 decks. And that is huge to think that 11 out of top 32 decks could be considered hand trap decks. But again, a big part of this was due to the perception of Phantom Knights going into the event. And so if we just take a quick look at the breakdown of these 11 decks, again, of the 7 that were clearly hand trap decks, you had 3 Dragon Link decks, 2 Brave Prank Kids, 1 Based Outlich, and then 1 Adventure Tinny. Of those 4 extra ones, there were 2 more Brave Prank Kid decks, the DDD deck, and then another Based Outlich deck. These final 4 were again just 1 card away, so like one of the Cyber's Outlich decks played 18 hand traps, where you need at least 19 hand traps in a 60 card deck to reach that threshold. 1 Brave Prank Kid deck played 13 hand traps in a 43 card deck, whereas if he had had 14 hand traps in the 43 card deck, he would have hit it. Pack playing his DDD deck also needed 1 more hand trap, and then same for the other Brave Prank Kid deck from top 16, 1 more hand trap would have hit him that threshold, even if he added it as a 42nd card in the deck. And now for the combo decks. I know the colors are a little crazy right now, but there were 18 combo decks with 10 of them being Floodgate combo decks. And so for the Floodgate decks, there were 3 base decks, with 2 of them being the Outlich Cyberse variant. There were 3 Drytron decks, 2 Brave Phantom Knights, and then 2 Fluandereezes. And so 8 of those 10 decks, the base, Drytron, and Phantom Knight decks, all use Artifact Scythe. And then the final 2, the 2 Fluandereeze decks, will you be utilizing the Barrier Statue, the Wind one. And so we have 10 Floodgate combo decks. All of these decks have combos that end on a Floodgate and then can back it up with protection as well. Also note that 5 of them, the 3 base decks and then the 2 Phantom Knight decks, all play the Adventure Engine. And so they have ways of stopping you very early on. Then Drytron, of course, is very versatile itself, and Fluandereeze. After that, we've got the 8 interactive combo decks. For those, we've got 2 Dragon Links, 2 Virtual World, 2 Brave Tinny, a Sword Soul, and then a DDD list. And now after that, you'll notice that I have less hand trap decks listed here. And the main reason for that is because some of the hand trap decks from before do categorize under multiple categories. And that's redundant, but if you look at the 2 Cyberse Outlich decks, they're playing enough hand traps to be considered a hand trap deck. However, they also can, like, their main combo does end on Scythe, and it is very to get into. And if you think about how they're winning most of their games, despite technically being able to be a hand trap deck, I think it's better to classify them as a floodgate deck. And so when it comes to pure hand trap decks, there are 5 of them. 4 Brave Prankit decks, and then 1 Dragon Link deck. And this is also including the decks that were 1 off from reaching that 50% threshold. And then finally we had these 7 decks that I couldn't quite categorize. 2 of them being Brave Prankit decks, which just had different lists, like they didn't quite play enough hand traps, they weren't even close. One of which played DPE and a couple of extra cards. The other played a Souls package, a huge Souls package with I think 3 Souls, 1 Illusion of Chaos, and droplets in the main deck, but not, I think maybe only like 8 hand traps, so not even close to being able to see 2, but they did well with it. We have the Eldritch, Earth Machine, and Sky Striker decks, all of which playing actual real trap card floodgates. So the Eldritch deck played 10 floodgates, Earth Machine 7, Sky Strikers 3. The crazy thing about this is that almost none, I don't think any of the decks in the top 32 main decked any spell or trap removal. And so you were able to steal games, especially with that Eldritch and Earth Machine decks, if you just drew your floodgates. Like you were easily just able to steal a game like that. And so that was a bit of a window of opportunity for these decks. And then we also had a Mech Knight and a Plunder Patrol deck. The Mech Knight deck I think is very analogous to what we've previously defined as a hand trap deck, in that it does play 14 going second cards, some of which being hand traps, but other which being other going second cards. And so if you think about it like that, they do reach and surpass that 50% threshold of seeing multiple going second cards. And so while it is not a hand trap deck, it does sort of meet the criteria for one, in a sense. And then for Plunder Patrols, they played 10 hand traps in a 40 card list. But the thing with Plunder Patrols, despite not being a hand trap deck, despite not producing floodgates and not producing a ton of interaction in different zones of the game, such as the interactive combo decks would do, they're very interesting in that they're not affected by Scythe very much, because on their own turn, they don't necessarily have to go into a bunch of extra deck plays, but instead they can make plays on the opponent's turn, and you can't be Scythed on your opponent's turn. And so they can use their plunder effects to get into their extra deck monsters then, and then to use their various effects to disrupt the opponent. And so they can really play around Scythe well and still generate their disruption on top of it. Like, they have a great Phantom Knight matchup. And so again, they took advantage of that particular thought process going into the event that Phantom Knights would be big, and then chose a great meta call for the event. And now it's a little bit more difficult to play against the interactive combo decks with this type of strategy, because their negates don't matter what turn you use them on, versus Scythe only being used on your turn. But Plunder Patrols were still a really good meta call for Vegas. And again, while we had these decks that didn't quite fit into a category, we can definitely see why they did well, and we could look at these as windows of opportunity for other decks, and as an example of how we really should be metagaming in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But we're going to get to that in a minute. And so now, after looking at the results of Vegas, I do just want to give a brief top 5 decks of the format. This is just my opinion. You might read the metagame a little bit differently. You might have some different thoughts based on your local metagame, but looking at the results from Vegas, what I'm seeing online on Dueling Book, and what I'm hearing, discussions about, it feels like the best deck of this current format. Actually, no, let's start at number 5 and go down. So the number 5 deck of the format is, in my opinion, Dragon Links. And I think the main thing that Dragon Links have going for them is how versatile they can be with their deck building. Because the Dragon engine is relatively small, it gives them the flexibility to play enough hand traps, as you guys saw, to be considered a hand trap deck, but also they have the resources and the access to the powerful cards in order to play as an interactive deck as well, because they have access to cards like Snow that they can dump to the graveyard. They have access to the Dragon Mate card, so they have access to Disruptive Spell and Traps as well. And if they wanted to, they could also play DPE and potentially Dagda as well. It's not as easy, but it is possible. And so I think that Dragon Link really has the opportunity to function as multiple different types of decks within this metagame, which can really give them an advantage when choosing what to play for any given tournament. At number 4, Virtual World. I think Virtual World definitely has to make this top 5 list, because it is probably the best interactive deck, the best interactive combo deck. It has the highest ceiling with the most diverse boards. You can end on boards of, like, you have floodgates like Chuchi and Scythe if you wanted to, but you also have, again, multiple different forms of interaction between Snow, Chuchi, Supreme, so many different things that you can do with Beatrice. And Shinshin in particular is very good this format, especially against Phantom Knights, especially against Prank Kids, against Based. Chuchi is really strong against Dragon Link. Not Chuchi, but Shinshin, I mean. You have so many strong matchups. The only downside is exactly what Dragon Links have going for them, and that's the inflexibility of their deck building. The virtual world engine is so large and you have to play so many of them that you don't have a lot of space for variance, and that can make them a little bit easier to counter in certain matchups or for certain tournaments. Like Virtual World could never be the best deck because every Virtual World deck is so similar that it could be countered very easily. But I think it definitely deserves a spot in this top 5, coming in at number 4. For number 3, we've got Brave Phantom Knights, which again was the scariest deck going into Vegas, but it is the best pure Scythe deck. And while other decks can summon Scythe, again, like Virtual World, like Dragon Link, like Based, like some of these other decks can summon Scythe, sure. But Phantom Knights is the best one for doing it. It's so streamlined within the combos, and they can even set up double Scythe or Scythe Lancey in order to play through a Forbidden Droplets or play through any sort of other disruption on the Scythe itself. Like they can summon Scythe multiple times on your opponent's turn or on their opponent's turn because Scythe is not once per turn. I think with that, with their ability to stun with Scythe, they also have a very high ceiling and they're able to easily OTK on that next turn. But in terms of Floodgate decks, the Phantom Knight deck is probably the best. For the number 2 spot on this list, I've got Prank Kids, this being the best hand trap deck. It's extremely efficient between their continuous spell card and then just the amount of advantage that you get just from playing Prank Kids. And then the fact that they gain life points and burn is pretty relevant, especially given time. Like it looks like Prank Kids do a lot better in like official events than they do in online tournaments, and I think that's a big reason why. But I think the best thing they have going for them is just the fact that they can play a high number of hand traps, they're extremely consistent, they're efficient, and they're able to play in these simplified game states that they create. And if you play them well and make the correct decisions, it can be very, very rewarding. And then finally coming in at number 1, the best deck of the format, you guys guessed it, it did win the YCS, but that is not why it is the best deck, but Based is the best deck of the format, and this includes the Cyberse Outlet variant. And the reason for it is very similar to Dragon Links in that it can choose to build its deck to play multiple roles, but I think more than any other deck in the current format, it can choose to be multiple roles all at the same time. And so if you look at Paulie's version of Base, the more traditional one that won the YCS, it plays less hand traps for sure, but it still does play a dynamic enough build to end on multiple forms of disruptions plus Scythe, so you can end on like negations and snow, or you can end on Scythe Lock, you can end on like Baron, Herald, etc. There's so many things that you can do so that it can truly function as multiple types of decks at the same time. And with the Cyberse Outlet variant deck, which is even better, is maybe a little bit less consistent, but it is able to function as all 3 types of decks at the same time, which is why it did particularly well. Its main combo does get you to dag the DPE so you can Scythe Lock your opponent. It also has access to multiple forms of disruption, being the Outlet engine as well as Snow, and then it can also play enough hand traps to see multiples in every single hand. And so I think its ability not only to play as each type of deck right now, but to also do it at the same time, easily makes it the best deck of the format. And then in that same regard, having the Outlet engine also gives them outs to some of the Floodgate decks too, not Floodgate combo decks, but the actual Floodgate decks. And so again, I mentioned that none of the top 32 decks played spell trap removal. Well, at least the Outlet deck has Golden Lord, which can be used from the hand to destroy like a skill drain or a summon limit or something like that. And so even though it is a 60 card list, you still do have access to those options. And if you can even just get a Lord in Graveyard, you can get it back to your hand. Or if you're under skill drain, just having a big beefy monster to beat down your opponents also can be huge. And so again, the top deck of the current format is Based, both the traditional Based and the Cyberse Outlet version, both of which are very, very powerful. And so given the format, the types of decks that are being successful, the top 5 individual decks, I think that in order to have success this format, you need to incorporate at least one of the format defining shifts that we've seen lately, as well as be resistant to one too. And so if we look at the Phantom Knight deck, for example, it incorporates Scythe as an auto win, but it also is backed by the Adventure engine, which gives it protection from hand traps. So that even if they get hand trapped, they can negate one. If they get hand trapped twice, they at least end on DPE, which gives them disruption. They probably have a Fog Blade, and then it also gives them a follow-up through Celestial. Adventure Tenyi, on the other hand, doesn't have an auto-win Floodgate monster, but it does have a high enough ceiling to play through multiple hand traps, and it has the deck space to also play a lot of hand traps as well. If you look at a deck like Floowandereeze, they've got their own Floodgate monster in Barrier Statue and also Impin, but they're also not affected by opposing Floodgate monsters, usually being Scythe. And so again, they incorporate one aspect of it, they're resistant to another. So I think when you're choosing a deck right now, you have to consider this and you have to wonder which function or which type of deck the deck you're looking at can be. So if you're trying to play a specific deck, can this deck be, or can it become a hand trap deck, or can it access a Floodgate monster, or does it have access to a diverse group of interruptions? How can you build your deck around one of these three ideas in order to be successful in the current format? I think if we look at examples of this just from the YCS, taking a look at that pure Eldritch list, they're resistant to most hand traps, they're resistant to floodgates, and they can also play their own floodgates in order to counter them, and they have a strong engine on top of it. If you look at the Mech Knight deck, they do not lose the Scythe at all, they're resistant to it, and then they play enough going second cards to be equivalent to a hand trap deck. So again, they're resistant to one of these format shifts, but also can be categorized as one of the main three types. A recent example that we covered on this channel was the pure Tri-Brigade deck, and obviously Tri-Brigades don't have access to Floodgate monsters, and their engine only makes 2 disruptions, being DPE or Appaloosa plus Revolt. I wouldn't quite necessarily call that an interactive combo deck because 1, it's not enough interactions, and 2, they're extremely similar. Even though Revolt is a trap, it summons a monster. And so instead, I chose to play and build it as a hand trap deck, which is why that build was playing 13 to 14 hand traps. And then from there, you're going to be solid against the Floodgate combo decks. You just have to decide whether or not you want to build it to improve the matchup against interactive combo decks, or maybe just go all in against those Floodgate decks. But the key is realizing that the deck is playable and competitive as long as you define the role that it can play within the format. And so I built this Tri-Brigade deck specifically to be able to perform in the current metagame, and I built it by the numbers to ensure the highest odds of success. If you do want to see the list, check out the deck profile right here on the screen, but if you would rather see one of the other top 5 decks just to get an idea of what you're going to be going against, check out the other video right here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.